Hello everyone. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. It was November 4th, 2017, and I remember how quiet the farm was that evening. My uncle's place sat a few miles west of Boone, Iowa, surrounded by flat, open land that rolled just slightly before dropping off into fields. The harvest had finished a few days earlier, and we were down to the last cleanup before the machines were parked for winter. Everything smelled like wet soil and rot, that mix of mud, corn husks, and old diesel that clings to your clothes no matter how many times you wash them. The air was heavy, too. Not storm-heavy, just still. Like even the wind didn't feel like moving. I went out around 6 to check the irrigation lines running along the south field. The sun had started dropping behind the tree line, laying this dull orange haze over the corn rows. The stalks were brittle now, half bent or broken from the harvest, and the sound they made in the wind was soft but constant, like paper rubbing together. I walked along the edge of the field, boots sinking into the soft mud every few steps, thinking about how we'd be done by tomorrow, and I could finally head home. Halfway across the field, I stopped to adjust one of the hoses. When I looked up again, I saw someone standing between the rows, maybe 40, 50 feet in. At first, I thought it was my uncle. The man wasn't moving, just standing dead still with his head tilted slightly, like he was trying to make out what I was doing. The light was dim enough that I couldn't tell if he was facing me or turned away, but there was something about the way he stood that felt off. His shoulders looked too straight, too stiff, like he was posing. I yelled out, just a quick, "Hey!" But the wind carried it down the field and nothing came back. He didn't move, didn't turn his head, didn't do anything. I figured maybe it was a neighbor checking something, or one of the seasonal workers who got lost. Still, something about it didn't sit right. I turned away to finish checking the lines. When I looked back again a few seconds later, he was still there, in the exact same spot. I remember how small the sound of the irrigation water suddenly seemed, how my breath felt too loud in the open air. I told myself I was being stupid, that it was just someone cutting through. I walked back toward the truck and decided to grab my flashlight from the barn before coming back to take a proper look. By the time I got back to the field, the light was gone completely. The sky had turned that dull, cold blue that comes right before full dark. I flicked the flashlight on and swept it along the rows, the beam catching bits of stubble and the glossy wetness of mud. The spot where I'd seen the man looked empty. The stalks shifted a little in the breeze, but that was it. I walked in, counting the rows. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's where he'd been standing. The ground was soft from the recent rain, so I figured I'd see his prints if anyone had been there. And I did. There were clear boot marks pressed deep into the mud. But they didn't make sense. The print started 6 rows in, right where I'd seen him, and ended there too. No trail leading up, none going out. Just a few solid steps, maybe 5 or 6 of them, all facing one direction and then nothing. I crouched down and aimed the light closer. The tread pattern looked familiar. Wide sole, a chipped section near the heel. My stomach sank a little. They looked just like my uncle's boots. Same brand, same wear. The same small tear near the back heel where the stitching had come loose months ago. I walked back to the truck, thinking maybe he'd been out earlier and I'd just overthought it. But when I mentioned it to him that night, he frowned and shook his head. He said he hadn't been near the south field in days. Said he'd been working around the machine shed since morning. He even lifted his boots to show me the dried mud on them. Caked from yesterday's rain, not fresh. I didn't say much after that, just nodded and let it go, but my mind kept circling it. The way that figure stood, the print starting and stopping in the middle of nowhere, the way the ground hadn't been disturbed anywhere else. That night I couldn't sleep right. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shape in the dim light again, the way it seemed to be waiting for something. Around midnight, I finally got up and went outside. The sky was cloudless, cold enough that my breath fogged. The field stretched black in every direction. No movement, no lights, no sound except the distant hum of the highway miles off. I walked down to the fence line just to look. The mud near the south field had hardened slightly since earlier, and I could still see where my own prints overlapped the others. I crouched again, ran my hand over the edge of one. It was deep. Whoever made it had been standing still for a while, enough for the weight to really press down. I looked for any sign of where they might have come from, any faint tracks from the other direction, but there was nothing. The field was empty. Over the next couple of days, I kept thinking about it. My uncle never brought it up again, and I didn't either. We finished cleanup, packed the equipment, and got ready for winter. But that spot stayed on my mind. Every time I passed it, I'd glance over, expecting to see something. Maybe the light catching just right, or another person by chance, but it was always empty. About a week later, I went back one last time before heading home. The ground had frozen by then, stiff and pale in the early morning light. The boot prints were still faintly visible, fossilized in the hardened mud. 6 deep impressions, clean and sharp, ending right where they began. I don't know what I saw that evening. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe someone passing through who didn't want to be seen. But what gets me even now is how the prints matched so perfectly. The same pattern, the same tear near the heel, the same angle my uncle's boots always left. A few weeks later, while helping him organize the storage shed, I noticed an old pair of his boots sitting under a bench. The soles were caked with dried mud, the stitching split at the heel. He told me he'd stopped wearing them around late October. Said one of them had split too badly to bother fixing. I asked when exactly he'd last worn them, and he thought for a moment before saying, around Halloween, maybe a few days before. That would have been November 1st. 3 days before I saw the man in the cornrows. That part stuck with me. The boots hadn't moved since. They sat under that bench for months, collecting dust and cobwebs. But sometimes when I'd go out there alone, I'd find fresh mud around that part of the floor, like something wet had been dragged in. No prints, no tracks leading to or from the door. Just a few drops, dried and dark, right where the old boots sat. I never told him that. I didn't see the point. We finished the season and went back to our separate routines. But I still think about that man standing between the rows. How still he was. How the ground held only those 6 prints and nothing more. The memory of that field, that strange, unmoving figure and those boots that matched exactly. It doesn't feel like something you misremember. It feels like something waiting, buried shallow beneath the surface, still standing there somewhere between the rows, in the cold November dark, where the ground never quite seemed to dry right again. The snow had started falling again by the time I crossed into Flagstaff. It wasn't heavy, just a quiet dust that softened the road signs and made the streetlights glow like weak lanterns. I'd been on the road for almost 12 hours, trying to make it from Los Angeles to Denver in one long push. I told myself I could do it if I just kept the windows cracked and the music up. But by the time I reached northern Arizona, my eyes burned every time I blinked. The highway had emptied hours ago, and the last bit of caffeine in my system was wearing off fast. I needed to stop. The first motel I saw sat just off the main road, next to a diner that looked half abandoned. The sign said, Snowcap Motor Inn, but half the bulbs were burnt out, so it read, Owcap Odor Inn. The parking lot was cracked and uneven, with a thin layer of snow blown into the low spots. A single truck sat near the far end, engine off, the hood dusted white. I parked near the office and sat for a second, engine idling, trying to convince myself it was good enough for one night. Inside, the lobby smelled like stale coffee and cigarette smoke that had soaked into the carpet. A small space heater hummed behind the counter. The clerk was an older guy, mid-60s maybe, wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He looked up when I walked in, eyes glassy like he hadn't slept much either. He asked for my ID, slid a small clipboard across the counter for my signature, and then paused with the key in his hand. I thought maybe he was just zoning out, but then he said, almost like he was trying to reassure himself, "You'll be fine. Just ignore the vent noise. I didn't know what that meant, and I was too tired to care. I nodded, muttered something about being out by morning, and he handed me the key. It was one of those old metal keys with a plastic diamond tag. Room 12. The walk to my room was short. The wind came in sharp bursts that carried the smell of wet asphalt and pine from somewhere nearby. Most of the rooms looked dark, curtains drawn. One had a dim light under the door. Maybe someone watching TV inside, but otherwise it felt like I was the only person there. Room 12 was at the end of the row. The door stuck when I tried to push it open, and when it finally gave way, a stale chemical smell came out. Like bleach that had sat too long. I flicked on the light. The room was small. 2 lamps, 1 bed, carpet stained near the door. The heater under the window rattled when I turned it on. I dropped my bag by the wall, kicked off my boots and sat on the edge of the bed. The blanket felt clean enough. I didn't bother pulling back the sheets to check. The only thing that really bothered me was the noise. A faint metallic hum coming from somewhere in the wall. It wasn't constant. More like short bursts of air followed by silence. Probably just old vents or pipes, I thought. I was too exhausted to care. I fell asleep with my jacket still on. When I woke up, it was dark except for the light from the parking lot bleeding through the curtains. My phone said it was 2:08 a.m. The heater had stopped. The room was colder now, and the air felt heavier somehow, like it hadn't been moving for a while. That's when I heard it. A voice coming from the vent near the bathroom. It wasn't loud, but it was close enough that I could tell it wasn't just pipes. It was fast, low, and shaky. I froze, listening. It was a woman. I couldn't make out every word, but I caught small pieces. "Please, tell him to stop." I sat there for a few seconds, not breathing, trying to figure out if I was still dreaming. The voice kept coming quick, like someone whispering through tears. I stood up and stared at the vent, half expecting to see something behind it, but it was just a metal grate. I waited. The voice stopped for a moment, then came back, quieter. I couldn't tell if it was in pain or afraid. Maybe both. I grabbed my phone and tried calling the front desk. It rang twice, then cut off with a flat tone. No one answered. I hung up and stared at the wall, listening again. The whispering had stopped. The silence after it was worse than the sound. I went into the bathroom and stood in front of the vent. It was about chest height, the kind of old vent cover with slats rusted around the edges. I leaned in, listening, and the smell hit me. Bleach, sharp and cold, mixed with something sour, like wet metal. I pulled back, gagging. For a few seconds, I just stood there staring at it, trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe the pipes connected to another room. Maybe someone was watching TV. Maybe the vent smell was from cleaning. But the air coming through that vent was still warm, like it was coming from somewhere close. Not the central system. I took my car key and started loosening the screws. My hands were shaking. The last screw dropped into the sink, and when I pulled the vent cover off, the smell doubled. It was so strong it burned the back of my throat. Behind the grate was darkness, a narrow duct maybe a foot wide. The metal inside was smeared with something dark, half covered by a new layer of white residue. Bleach. The kind that leaves that fake clean smell no matter how much you scrub. The whisper didn't come back after that. I stood there for a long time, staring into the vent, waiting for something else to move or breathe, but it was silent. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the chair near the window, shoes on, watching the snow drift past the yellow light outside. Around dawn, I packed my things, threw them in the car, and went to the front desk. The clerk was there, sitting behind the counter, drinking coffee from a paper cup. He looked surprised to see me that early. I told him about the vent, about the whisper, about the smell. He set the cup down slowly, staring at me like he didn't understand at first. Then the color drained from his face. He asked me what room I was in. I told him. Room 12. He didn't say anything for a few seconds, then just muttered something under his breath and walked into the back office. I could hear him flipping through papers, drawers opening, something falling. When he came back, he looked pale. He told me that room wasn't supposed to be rented out, that it had been sealed since last winter. I just stared at him, thinking he was joking, but he wasn't. He said there'd been an incident. Something about a woman who'd gone missing. The police had checked the room but never found anything. He said they shut it down after a cleanup waiting on an insurance claim. But the maintenance guy must have mixed up the keys. I told him I'd stayed in it all night. He didn't say much after that, just stared past me at the window, jaw clenched. I dropped the key on the counter and left without another word. Outside, the snow had stopped, and the air was bright and thin. My car was covered in a thin white layer, like the night had tried to hide everything that happened. I got in, started the engine, and pulled onto the road. I didn't look back until I hit the main highway. From a distance, the motel looked even smaller, sitting alone at the edge of the trees. For a second, I thought I saw someone standing near the room I'd stayed in. Just a dark shape against the door. But when I blinked, it was gone. Probably just a shadow from the sign flickering above it. By the time I crossed the state line into New Mexico, the smell of bleach still lingered faintly in my jacket. I rolled the window down, letting the cold air in, and kept driving until the sun was high enough to make the snow glare white in the mirror. I never stopped in Flagstaff again. And I never drove straight through from Los Angeles to Denver after that. I always made sure to plan my stops ahead. Somewhere with lights, people, and doors that didn't stick when you opened them. It was around 1 in the morning when I found myself on Route 9, heading east out of Bangor toward Machias. That stretch of road always felt isolated, even during the day. At night, it was worse. Nothing but dense forest on both sides and long empty miles with no gas stations or cell towers for what felt like forever. I had the radio on low, a weak AM signal fading in and out, mostly static. The air outside was cold enough that I could see my breath when I stopped for gas earlier. November air in Maine cuts through everything, even the heater inside the car. About 20 miles past the Whiting turnoff, the fog came in. Not a slow drift, not a soft roll like you see near the coast, and it hit like a wall. I'd been driving maybe 55, and suddenly the high beams were bouncing right back at me, lighting up nothing but gray soup. I slowed to 30, then 20, hugging the right side of the lane so I could keep sight of the white line beside my tire. My phone had lost service about 10 minutes before, so GPS was useless. The only thing keeping me company was the low hum of the engine and the rhythmic sound of the tires on cracked asphalt. Every now and then, I'd pass one of those green highway markers, tiny reflective signs with numbers that tell you where you are. I remember squinting to read one, mile 217. It meant I still had a good stretch before reaching Machias. The fog was getting thicker by the minute, and I couldn't shake this weird sense that I was the only person alive on that road. No headlights behind me. No taillights ahead. Just the beam of my own lights floating in gray, nothing. A few minutes later, something red flickered up ahead through the fog. My first thought was taillights. Maybe someone had stopped. Then it looked more like a moving light, low to the ground, swinging side to side. As I got closer, I realized it was a flare. Someone was waving a red road flare on the shoulder, the light cutting through the fog in short bursts. I eased my foot off the gas, the tires crunching against gravel near the edge of the pavement. The figure holding the flare was tall, maybe 6 foot, wearing a dark jacket that looked almost black in the red light. I couldn't make out his face, just the way his arm moved in a slow, deliberate motion, signaling me to slow down. I cracked my window just an inch or two, enough to hear him shout over the hiss of the flare and the rumble of my car. His voice carried through the fog, flat, urgent, echoing in a strange way. "Accident ahead!" That was all I caught, just those 2 words. My gut tensed up immediately. The kind of tone he had wasn't panicked. It was firm, like he was trying to warn me before something bad. I slowed more, rolling to maybe 10 miles an hour. I scanned the fog ahead, expecting to see wreckage, maybe a car in a ditch, broken glass, headlights off the road, something. Then I noticed a second flare up ahead, burning right in the middle of my lane. I stopped completely about 15 feet away from it. The red light flickered through the fog, bright enough that it painted the inside of my windshield in a soft glow. But there was something wrong about it. It was lying in the center of a fresh puddle. When I leaned forward, I realized it wasn't water. The flare was burning in the middle of a dark, wet pool that was too thick, too dark. It was blood. The heat from the flare made it hiss and bubble slightly, like oil on a pan. Steam rose off it in thin ribbons that disappeared into the fog. My first instinct was to grab my phone, but it still said, "No service." I looked around for the man with the flare, the one who'd warned me. He wasn't there anymore. Just the hiss of the burning flare and the sound of my engine idling. I remember sitting there, frozen, my fingers gripping the wheel tight. I kept expecting someone to come running out of the fog. Maybe another driver or a trooper, or someone asking for help. But nothing moved. The fog just swirled, slow and heavy like smoke. The forest beyond the road was silent. Not even crickets or wind through the trees. I put the car in park and turned on the hazards. The lights flashed weakly against the fog. I debated getting out. Maybe check if someone was hurt. Maybe see if a car had gone off the road. But the puddle of blood told me enough. If there had been an accident, it had just happened. And whoever that man was, he wasn't there anymore. For a few seconds, I rolled my window all the way down, trying to listen. I thought I heard something. Faint, metallic, like the distant clatter of something dragging across asphalt. Came from somewhere ahead, past where the flare was burning. Then it stopped. Every instinct in me said to get out of there. I put the car back in drive and steered around the flare, staying as far left as I could without crossing into the other lane. The tires rolled just close enough that I could smell the iron scent of the blood. As the fog swirled in my headlights, my stomach turned. I drove another half-mile before I saw the faint outline of what looked like tire tracks cutting off the road into the ditch. I slowed again, but I couldn't see much. Just the edge of broken grass and something glinting near a tree. Maybe glass, maybe chrome. I wasn't sure. The fog made everything impossible to judge. I thought about stopping again. But I didn't, I couldn't. Something about the air felt wrong. Thick, heavy, like the whole stretch of road was holding its breath. I kept driving, slowly. The flare's red glow faded behind me until it disappeared completely, swallowed by the fog. After another couple miles, the air started to clear a little. By the time I reached Machias, my hands were still shaking. I pulled into a closed gas station lot and just sat there with the engine off, trying to calm down. I told myself it must have been a hit and run. Maybe the man with the flare was a witness who left to get help. Maybe the driver panicked and fled. The explanations didn't feel right, but they were the only ones I had. I ended up staying in my car until daylight, too shaken to drive any farther. The next morning, when I finally got coffee and cell service, I checked the local news. There it was, right near the stretch I'd been on Route 9 east of Whiting. Around 12:45 a.m., a truck driver had struck a pedestrian in heavy fog. The report said the impact killed him instantly. No mention of another car, no mention of flares. The road had been closed most of the morning while police investigated. I looked at the timestamp on the article. 12:45 a.m. I had checked the clock on my dashboard when I first saw the man waving the flare. It read 12:48, 3 minutes. That was all that separated me from whatever had just happened. 3 minutes, maybe even less. I thought about that puddle of blood, still fresh and wet. The flare burning in the middle of it like someone had placed it there just seconds before I arrived. I thought about the man's voice. Clear, calm, saying, "Accident ahead," whoever he was. He wasn't standing there when the police found the scene. I never told anyone about what I saw that night. Not the flares, not the blood, not the man. The official report said it was a single fatality, a pedestrian struck by a long-haul truck. But I know what I saw. The blood was still warm. The flare was still burning. And someone somehow was standing there warning me not to keep going. Just minutes after he'd already died on that same stretch of road. Every time I drive Route 9 now, especially at night, I slow down when the fog starts to roll in. I can still picture that burning flare in the middle of the road, hissing in the mist, marking a place where someone's life ended just moments before I came through. It's been years, but that image never left me. Some nights when the weather turns thick and silent, I can almost smell the smoke again, faint and sharp, as if the warning's still hanging there in the fog. It was drizzling and cold that night, the kind of steady, fine rain that doesn't pour but seeps into everything. Your jacket, your shoes, your hair, your mood. I was on Highway 41, somewhere between Knoxville and Bristol, heading east. The clock on the dash read a few minutes past 9. The sky was black. No moon, no stars. Just the wet reflection of my headlights bouncing off the yellow lines. I hadn't passed another car in nearly 20 minutes. The wipers squeaked every few seconds, and the sound had become hypnotic. My eyes were tired from the road, from the endless dark stretching out in front of me. The air smelled faintly of rain and wet asphalt, and the heater was blowing warm air at my legs. I was thinking about stopping soon. Maybe a rest area, maybe just to stretch my back. That's when I saw her. She was standing by the guardrail near mile marker 173. I noticed her first as a pale blur on the edge of the road, like a reflection that didn't belong. When I got closer, the details came into focus. A thin young woman, maybe in her early 20s, wearing a light jacket and jeans, her bare feet planted in the mud. Her hair was dark and plastered to her face from the rain. She wasn't moving, just standing there, facing the opposite lane, one arm hanging loose at her side. At first I thought she might have been in an accident or maybe her car broke down. Instinct kicked in and I slowed down, pulling onto the shoulder a few yards ahead of her. The tires crackled over the gravel, and the red glow of my taillights lit up the wet road behind me. I left the engine running, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped out into the drizzle. The cold hit me immediately, that damp, sharp air that sinks straight through your clothes. I called out to her, but she didn't answer. She just turned her head slightly in my direction, enough that I could see her face from the side. Her skin looked pale under the beam of my headlights, her lips a shade too dark, like she'd been standing out there for hours. Her voice, when she finally spoke, came out low and rough, like her throat was raw. She said, "Don't look down there." The way she said it froze me for a moment. Her tone wasn't angry or scared. It sounded tired, like she'd already said it too many times. I looked past her toward the guardrail. The drop on the other side wasn't steep, just a small ravine, the kind that collects runoff when it rains. But something about the way she said it made me uneasy. I don't know why I didn't listen. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the way her eyes stayed locked on me, unblinking. I stepped toward the guardrail, my boots sinking into the soft shoulder. The beam of my flashlight trembled slightly in my hand as I pointed it down the slope. That's when I saw it. The glint of metal through the weeds, the faint reflection of light in shattered glass. There was a car down there, upside down, wedged between two trees. Its headlights were still faintly on, the beams cutting across the wet grass. Steam or smoke, I couldn't tell which, was curling up from the crumpled hood. For a second I thought I saw movement inside, but it was just the rain dripping from branches. The scene looked too fresh to make sense. I checked my watch again, thinking maybe the wreck had just happened, that she'd crawled out and come up to the road for help. I called 911, standing there by the rail with the rain trickling down my face. The dispatcher asked for the mile marker, what I could see if anyone was hurt. I told her about the woman, the car in the ravine, the headlights still burning. She told me to stay put, said troopers were on their way. By the time I hung up and turned back toward the shoulder, the woman was gone. I scanned both sides of the road with my flashlight, calling out again. The rain was coming down a little harder now, and I could hear the hiss of it against the trees. There were no footprints in the mud except mine. The shoulder sloped slightly downhill on both sides, and I checked as far as the light would reach, but she wasn't anywhere nearby. The only thing I noticed was a small patch of disturbed dirt near the guardrail, where she'd been standing, like she'd been there for a long time, shifting her feet back and forth. I waited about 15 minutes before the flashing blue lights appeared behind me. 2 state troopers pulled up, followed by a tow truck a few minutes later. They asked what happened, and I told them everything exactly as it was. They walked to the guardrail with me, shining their powerful lights down into the ravine. One of them climbed down the slope while the other stayed up top, radioing in details. I stood there shivering, the rain dripping off the brim of my hat, feeling that strange mix of adrenaline and confusion. When the trooper below called back up, his voice carried through the still night air. He said the wreck wasn't fresh. That didn't make sense to me at first. He said the car was cold, the windows fogged from the inside but dry like it hadn't been touched in days. The plates were from Kentucky. They found a wallet wedged under the passenger seat, and the trooper read the name out loud. I didn't recognize it. They said the crash must have happened 3 nights earlier, maybe during the storm that came through the area on Sunday. The driver had been found the next day, thrown from the car, but they hadn't been able to locate his daughter. Search teams had gone through the ravine and the nearby woods, but found nothing. I remember standing there, the rain pooling around my boots, trying to process that. One of the troopers asked me again about the woman I'd seen. I told him everything. Her height, her hair, what she was wearing, how she'd told me not to look down there. I could tell by his expression that he didn't quite know what to make of it. They went over the area with flashlights, checking the ditches and trees. They even brought out a K9 unit an hour later. Nothing. Not a single footprint, no trace of anyone walking away. The rain had turned into a steady downpour by then. My clothes were soaked through, and the cold had settled deep into my fingers. I watched as they pulled the car out of the ravine, the sound of the winch echoing across the highway. The vehicle came up caked in mud and branches, the roof crushed nearly flat. Inside on the passenger side was a small pink sneaker, half buried under broken glass. I didn't say anything. I just watched. There was something deeply unsettling about that. Seeing the shoe, thinking about the barefoot woman standing by the road, the one who'd told me not to look. The troopers talked quietly among themselves, one of them glancing over at me now and then. They took my statement, asked for my license, my contact information. I signed the report and stood under the tailgate of one of their trucks to stay out of the rain while they finished up. It was close to midnight when they told me I could go. The tow truck left first, its taillights disappearing around the bend. I sat in my car for a while before turning the key. The inside smelled like damp upholstery and cold air. The wipers cleared the windshield, and I just stared out at the guardrail for a few seconds before pulling back onto the highway. For the rest of the drive, I kept replaying it all. How she looked, what she said, the exact tone of her voice. There was no sense to it. I knew what the troopers thought, that maybe I'd imagined her, maybe I'd seen something in the rain that wasn't there. But I knew what I saw. A few days later, I checked the local news online. There was a short article about the accident. A father and his teenage daughter, driving home from a weekend trip. He'd lost control on the wet road and gone over the edge. The headline said both bodies had been recovered. The daughter's was found nearly 100 yards downstream from the crash site, caught between 2 rocks in the creek bed. I sat there staring at the photo they used, a picture from a school event. Her smiling dark hair over her shoulders. She looked exactly like the girl I saw standing by the guardrail. The report said search teams had located her after the rain let up on Wednesday morning, just hours after I made that call. Sometimes, when I think about that night, I still see her standing there in the rain, barefoot and quiet, warning me not to look. Not angry, not pleading, just tired, like she already knew what I'd find. My cousin and I drove up to his family's hunting cabin near Stillwater for Thanksgiving break. It was deep in the woods, tucked between pines and frozen ground, far from any paved road. The cabin had no running water, no cell signal, and the only power came from an old generator that sputtered every time it started up. His uncle used it mostly during deer season, but no one had been there since early October. The idea was to spend a few quiet days away from everything. Fish a little, cut firewood, and just relax before heading back to school. We got there just before dark on a Tuesday. The air was sharp and cold, the kind that bites your face when you breathe in. Frost already coated the grass near the lake, and the wind came off the water with a dull hiss. The cabin sat maybe 30 yards from the edge of the lake, small and simple. One main room with bunks along the wall, a wood stove, and a little kitchenette. We unpacked, fired up the generator, and got the stove going. By nightfall, the place felt warm enough to sit in shirt sleeves, and the smell of wood smoke filled the air. After dinner, we played cards and talked for a while, listening to the wind scrape through the trees. Around 11, I stepped outside to pee. My breath came out in white clouds and the ground crunched faintly under my boots. That's when I saw them, footprints in the frost. At first, I thought they were ours, but when I crouched down, I noticed they were barefoot. Clear outlines of toes, heels, and arches pressed into the frosty ground. The tracks led from the direction of the lake straight to the back porch of the cabin. They didn't look old either. The edges were clean, not melted or smudged by wind. Whoever made them had been there recently, maybe within an hour or two. I followed them for a few steps until the frost grew too patchy to see them clearly, then went back inside. I didn't mention it right away. Felt strange, but maybe someone had been swimming or just walking around earlier, though the thought of anyone barefoot in that cold didn't make sense. That night, I kept thinking about those prints. I pictured someone standing out there, feet freezing in the dirt, watching the cabin. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of the generator cutting off. It was quiet except for the ticking of the cooling metal. I lay there listening, waiting for it to start again, but it didn't. The silence felt heavy, like something pressing on my chest. I pulled the blanket tighter and tried to go back to sleep. The next morning, when I went outside to refill the gas tank for the generator, I saw them again. New prints, the same shape, same bare feet, but this time they went around the cabin. They looped near the woodpile, then curved toward the outhouse. The frost was lighter that morning, but the prints were deep and fresh, the toes clear in the dirt. It looked like whoever it was had circled the cabin during the night. We looked around the property but didn't find anything else. No discarded clothes, no food wrappers, nothing. The woods were quiet. Even the lake was still, just a thin layer of ice near the edges. I tried to tell myself it was nothing serious, maybe some local guy or drifter passing through, but the bare feet didn't make sense. The nights were below freezing. Nobody could walk barefoot for long without freezing. That day we went down to the edge of the lake to chop some wood and clear brush. The ground was soft in spots where the frost had melted, and I saw faint impressions there too, like someone had walked along the shore recently. The more I looked, the more I noticed them. They seemed to appear and fade randomly, some overlapping, some leading nowhere. That evening we kept the fire going late. The generator hummed outside, steady this time, and the cabin was warm. I tried not to think about the prints, but every time I looked toward the window, I imagined seeing someone out there, just standing in the dark. Sometime after midnight, I woke up again. I wasn't sure what had stirred me. Maybe a sound. Maybe the cold draft slipping through the cracks in the wall. I lay still for a minute, eyes open, and that's when I heard it, breathing. Slow, heavy, and close. It came from just outside the window, maybe a foot or two away. I could hear the rhythm of it, deep inhales followed by slow exhalations. Not animal noises, not snorting or growling. Human. I stayed frozen, listening. My cousin shifted in his sleep, and the breathing paused for a moment, then started again, steadier now. My skin prickled all over. I didn't move until the sound faded, replaced by the creak of the porch boards and the faint crunch of footsteps moving away into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there until faint light started showing through the cracks in the curtains. When morning came, I went outside right away. The frost was heavy again, and the prints were there, clear as ever. They started near the window where I'd heard the breathing, then went around the corner toward the woods. I followed them until they disappeared into a patch of dead leaves near the tree line. We didn't say much that morning. We packed up quietly, loaded the truck, and checked the cabin one last time. I looked under the bunks, behind the stove, anywhere someone might have hidden, even though I didn't think they'd be inside. When I stepped out to load the last bag, I noticed something odd near the steps. A bit of torn fabric sticking out from the underside of the porch. I bent down and pulled at it. It was part of a sleeping bag, old, dirty, and ripped open along the side. I crouched lower and saw the rest of it stuffed under the steps, along with a few plastic bottles and what looked like a crushed can of beans. There were bits of torn clothing, too, and a small, matted pillow. It hit me then. Someone had been living there, right under the cabin, maybe for days. The thought made my stomach twist. That meant whoever had been walking barefoot, whoever I'd heard breathing outside, had probably been sleeping just a few feet beneath where we were. I looked again at the space under the steps. It was small, dark, just enough for one person to curl up. The sleeping bag looked weathered, but not frozen stiff, which meant it had been used recently. We didn't stay to look any closer. We shut off the generator, locked the door, and left. The drive out of the woods felt longer than it had on the way in. The trees closed in along the road, and the cold morning light made everything look dull and lifeless. I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see someone walking along the road behind us. When we finally hit the main highway, I felt like I could breathe again. We didn't talk much about it after that. It was easier to just move on. Pretend it was one of those strange things that happens in the middle of nowhere. But I still think about it sometimes. How close that person had been. How they'd circled the cabin, watched us through the windows, and slept right beneath us while we lay warm inside. Every sound that night had meant something. The faint creak, the crunch of frost, the slow breathing outside the wall. It wasn't my imagination. It was someone trying to survive the cold, hidden under a cabin in the woods, watching two strangers live in the warmth just a few feet above them. And I keep wondering what might have happened if I'd gone out there again that night, instead of staying still and listening. It was November 6, 2022 in Philadelphia. The temperature had dropped fast that week, the kind of cold that seeps through old windows and sits in your bones. Our apartment was small, a 2-bedroom on the edge of South Philly, right above a closed-down barber shop. The paint on the stairwell peeled off like dried skin, and the hallway lights flickered every few minutes. I had lived there for almost a year with my roommate Tyler. He moved in that spring after answering a Craigslist ad. He was quiet, kind of messy, but he paid his half on time, at least for the first few months. By November, he'd been behind on rent for almost 6 weeks. He always had excuses, said his check was delayed, or that his cousin owed him money. I didn't press him too hard. I was working long shifts at the hospital, and the last thing I wanted to do when I got home was argue about bills. Still, things had started to feel off around him. He barely talked, barely came out of his room. The smell of cigarettes had started drifting through the vents, even though he promised not to smoke inside. He'd spend nights pacing in the kitchen. I could hear the floorboards creak through the walls. I thought he was stressed, maybe depressed. Everyone was struggling that year. Then one morning he was just gone. I woke up around 8 a.m. The apartment was unusually quiet, and his bedroom door was open. Inside, the bed was stripped down to the mattress, the sheets gone. The closet was empty, too. It looked like he'd left in a hurry. But what caught my eye was his phone, still plugged in on the kitchen counter. The screen had dozens of unread notifications, mostly messages from some girl named Marcy, and a few missed calls from Mom. His wallet was gone, but the charger cable was still bent into the shape of his phone. I stood there for a minute thinking maybe he'd stormed out after an argument or something, but we hadn't spoken in 2 days. By noon I texted him anyway. No reply. That night I heard the radiator knock like it always did when the heat tried to kick in, and I told myself he'd just skipped town to avoid paying rent. It wasn't the first time someone had done that in this building. The landlord, Mr. Jensen, was used to it. The next morning, around 9 a.m., Mr. Jensen called me. His voice was shaky in that way old people get when they're trying not to sound nervous. He said, someone saw movement downstairs around 3 a.m. near the basement door, but nobody came out. I asked what he meant, and he told me that one of the tenants from the first floor thought they saw a flashlight moving around through the basement window. Could have been a squatter, he said. Or maybe Tyler grabbing his stuff. After I hung up, I sat there for a while, staring at the basement door at the end of our hallway. We didn't go down there much. It was more of a shared storage space full of old paint cans, broken furniture, and dust so thick you could taste it. I never thought of it as dangerous, just forgotten. But now, knowing someone might have been down there at 3 a.m., I couldn't stop staring at that door. I waited until late afternoon to check it out. The light switch at the top of the stairs didn't work. It hadn't for months, so I used my phone flashlight and started down. The air grew colder the deeper I went. By the time I reached the bottom, the smell hit me, metallic and damp like wet iron mixed with rot. The concrete floor was stained in places, dark patches spreading out under the pipes. I followed the beam of my light to the back corner and saw Tyler's mattress folded against the wall. He had dragged it down there somehow, and behind it the wall looked cracked, like someone had hit it with a hammer or crowbar. The concrete floor near it had a fresh break, about 3 feet across. Pieces of chipped cement were scattered around, and a small pile of dirt had been pushed aside. It looked like a shallow pit dug by hand. I crouched down to get a closer look, and that's when I saw it. A single sock lying inside the hole, half covered in dust. It was gray, same kind Tyler always wore. Right next to it was a small metal ring glinting faintly under the light. I reached for it and froze. It was my spare key set. I kept that key set in my dresser drawer upstairs, locked away in a small box. I'd never given Tyler a copy. My stomach turned. I dropped the keys and backed up until my shoulder hit the wall. The smell in the air seemed heavier now, like something sweet and rotting had mixed in with the metallic tang. I covered my nose and climbed the stairs fast, shutting the basement door behind me. I didn't go back down. That night I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the building set me off. The wind rattling the windows, the heater banging, footsteps from the apartment above. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard something faint below me, like scraping or shifting. I tried to tell myself it was the pipes, but I could feel it. A vibration through the floorboards, small but steady, like someone moving dirt. I didn't move. I stayed in bed until sunrise. The next day, I called the landlord again, told him about the hole, about the smell. He said he'd come by after lunch to check it out. I left the apartment and walked around the block for hours, too anxious to be inside. When I came back, his truck was parked out front. I went in expecting to find him upstairs, but the apartment was empty. His jacket hung over the banister, and his keys were on the counter. I called out his name, nothing. The basement door was open. I stood there for a long time, staring down those dark stairs. The smell was stronger now, sour and metallic. My phone flashlight flickered as I stepped down. "Mr. Jensen?" I called, my voice cracking a little. There was no answer, but I could see that the mattress had been moved again, pushed farther into the corner. The dirt pile was gone. The hole was deeper, wider, like someone had kept digging. My heart started pounding and I turned to leave. But just as I did, my shoe caught something soft near the bottom step. It was another sock. When the police came later, I told them everything. About Tyler vanishing, about the hole, about finding my spare keys. They searched the basement for hours. I waited upstairs, staring at the thin crack of light under the basement door, listening to their muffled voices. Eventually, one of them came up and told me to sit tight. Another hour passed before they came back up again, quieter now. They didn't say much, just that the floor had been dug up recently, and that they needed to take soil samples. They told me to find another place to stay for the night. I packed a small bag and left. When I passed the landlord's truck, the passenger door was still open, and his flashlight lay on the ground beside it. I didn't see him again after that day. The police kept the property sealed off for weeks. Eventually, they said the hole led to an old drainage line, long abandoned, running beneath the building. They wouldn't say what else they found down there, only that they were still investigating. But I overheard one of the officers saying the words, "partial remains," before the door closed behind them. I moved out before December. The apartment building sat empty for months after that. Sometimes I still think about the sound I heard that night, the slow scraping beneath the floorboards. I wonder if Tyler ever meant to leave, or if he'd been down there all along, digging into something he shouldn't have found. I still have his phone. It never locked itself, never lost charge. It just sits in a box in my closet now, screen cracked, battery somehow still full. When I plug it in, the screen flashes once before going dark, and for a second I swear I can hear that faint sound again. Dirt shifting, something moving, far below the floor. We lived in a small valley just outside Murfreesboro, Tennessee, tucked between two low ridges that blocked most of the wind. It was quiet country. Spread out houses, dirt drives, long fields, and power lines that cut through the hollows like black thread. At night you could hear the trains from town echo through the hills, faint and rhythmic. Most nights were the same. Cicadas, dogs barking down the road, maybe a truck passing once or twice before everything settled back into stillness. That night, it was late, around 11:30 p.m. I was half asleep on the couch, the TV still on mute. There wasn't any storm forecasted. The air outside had been still for hours, humid and heavy but calm. Then, out of nowhere, the tornado sirens started. They wailed so loud it shook the windows. I sat up thinking maybe there'd been some emergency alert I'd missed. But when I looked outside, there was no lightning, no rain, no wind at all. Just that hollow mechanical scream bouncing off the hills. It sounded wrong in the clear air, like it didn't belong. Within minutes, lights flicked on across the valley. I could see people stepping out onto porches, confused. A few trucks pulled onto the road, their headlights sweeping across yards. You could tell everyone was waiting for the same thing. Wind, thunder, anything. But nothing came. Just the sirens screaming over still trees and motionless fields. Then, just as suddenly as they'd started, they stopped. All at once. No fade out, no stagger between the towers, just dead silence. It felt unnatural, like sound had been vacuumed out of the air. You could hear your own breathing, and the faint ticking of power lines in the distance. I stood out there for a while, listening. The air had that thick, pressed feeling right before dawn, but it wasn't even midnight yet. A couple of porch lights clicked off one by one, and I figured people were heading back inside, probably thinking it was a glitch in the system. But as I turned to go back in, I felt something strange. A vibration in the ground, faint at first, like when a big truck passes. It wasn't a tremor exactly. It came in short pulses, like something heavy moving somewhere far away. Then came the sound. At first it was just a low hum, so distant I thought it was a generator. It had that steady mechanical tone, like something spinning fast. It came from somewhere over the ridge, not loud enough to scare you, but enough to make you notice. It went on for maybe half a minute, then grew louder. It had depth to it, a low, throbbing pitch that made the windows buzz in their frames. I remember stepping out into the middle of the yard and looking up, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The sky was clear, no clouds, no planes, nothing but stars and that black outline of the ridge. The sound rolled down through the valley like a wave. You could feel it in your chest. Then the power poles started to sway. I'm not exaggerating, they were actually bending, like someone had grabbed them and was pushing them back and forth. My neighbor's security camera caught it later. The poles along the road bowing in rhythm with that deep vibration. The wires snapped tight and rattled, throwing sparks near one of the transformers. The air buzzed so hard I could taste metal. I stood frozen, watching them move. The noise got louder until it was all I could hear. Not just sound, but pressure. Like your eardrums were being pushed from the inside. I remember thinking something had exploded miles away, like a quarry blast or maybe a sonic boom. But it didn't stop. It just kept rolling, low and constant. Then, just like the sirens, it stopped. Everything went still again. No hum, no wind, just complete silence. That's when I noticed it, the dogs. Or rather, the lack of them. Every night in that valley, there was always barking from somewhere. Strays, farm dogs, you name it. But that night, nothing. Not one bark, no crickets, no night birds, no movement in the woods. It was as if the whole valley had gone numb. I stayed outside for maybe another 10 minutes, waiting for something else to happen. The air felt thick, hard to breathe. It had that charged smell, like after lightning, but there hadn't been a single flash. When I finally went back in, the clock read 12:06. I didn't sleep much. Around 2 a.m., the power flickered off for a few seconds, then came back. I thought about calling the sheriff's office, but I figured half the county probably already had. In the morning, I drove down to the Crossroads store to get coffee, and that's when I saw everyone else talking about it. Nobody knew what it had been. Someone said the county was calling it a system malfunction. Another said the Air Force Base over in Smyrna had been doing night tests. But people didn't buy it. There hadn't been any notice, no alerts, nothing. And the weirdest part, the siren logs from that night showed no scheduled activation at all. A few days later, one of the guys down the road showed me footage from his security camera. You could see the power poles along the road swaying, the lines bowing out like rubber bands. There was no visible wind, no lightning, just those poles moving on their own. The county sent some engineers to check for ground vibrations, but they said everything was within normal range. Weeks went by. The story faded a little, but people still talked about it. That fall, the weather changed early. Long nights, heavy fog in the valley. Folks started saying the air felt strange after dark, like it carried a hum you could barely hear. Some swore they felt their houses shake now and then, just faintly, like a passing train that never arrived. By November, a few families had packed up and left. One of the older couples, the Hanleys, said they couldn't sleep anymore, that the ground never felt still. Another guy, a farmer, moved his livestock out after half his cattle started breaking through fences during the night, spooked by nothing visible. He said they'd stand facing the ridge, shaking, but there'd be nothing there. I stayed through the winter. The nights grew quieter. No animals, barely any sound from the woods. The sirens never went off again, not once. They even removed the old tower by the fire station without any announcement. When I asked about it at the county office, they said it was being decommissioned due to maintenance costs. But that wasn't what bothered me. What got under my skin was the silence that followed. Even now, years later, when I drive through that valley, it feels wrong. The air doesn't carry sound the same way. You can yell, and it feels like it doesn't travel far, like something swallows it. I still think about that night, the hum, the way the poles moved, how every living thing seemed to stop breathing for a while. I've read every report, every local article. The official term they used was sonic disturbance non-seismic. No origin identified, no explanation given, but I was there. I know what I felt. The sound didn't come from the sky, and it didn't come from the ground. It came through both, like it was passing through everything at once. Air, earth, walls, bone. After that winter, more than half the valley emptied out. Houses went up for sale cheap, some never bought. Fields grew over. The last time I drove past my old place, the porch light was still hanging there, swaying in the wind, but nobody lived inside. We never got another siren, not even during real storms. When tornado season rolled around again, they told us to rely on phone alerts instead. But every time I see the sky turn green or the air go still, I think back to that clear night when the siren screamed for no reason at all, and whatever followed made the whole valley hold its breath. It was November 7th, 2018. A Wednesday night in upstate New York, cold enough that the air bit through your jacket if you stood outside too long. The first flurries of the season had started drifting down that evening, lazy and sparse, collecting in the cracks of the firehouse driveway and on the hoods of the trucks parked out front. I was on the overnight volunteer shift, one of the slower ones. Our small-town firehouse didn't get much action this time of year. The occasional chimney fire, a fender bender on the county road, sometimes a medical assist for one of the older residents. Mostly it was just a long, quiet night of waiting. The firehouse sat on the edge of town, right before the road dipped toward the old bridge and the woods beyond. It was a squat brick building from the 70s, with 2 garage bays for the engines, a smaller one for the rescue truck, and a side door that opened into a dim hallway leading to the kitchen and bunk room. The floors were always half wet with melted snow and road grime that clung to boots. The heater rattled constantly, trying to push back the chill that seeped through the walls. I'd done enough overnights there to know every sound it made. The soft hum of the soda machine, the echo of trucks shifting in the wind outside, the occasional pop of expanding metal from the bay doors. That night was dead quiet. The scanner was on low volume, just a faint buzz of static now and then. I sat at the little wooden table in the kitchen, flipping through old call reports, eating from a bag of pretzels I found in the cupboard. The clock above the sink said 1:58 a.m. I remember it clearly because I was debating whether to go crash in the bunk room or make another cup of coffee to stay up a bit longer. I figured I'd check the trucks once more, just out of habit, before calling it a night. But then I heard it, the side door creaking open. It was slow, like someone easing it just enough to slip inside. It wasn't unusual for one of the guys to come by late. A few of the older volunteers smoked outside when things got dull. Sometimes went to sit in their trucks for a bit, maybe talk on the phone. I waited for the sound of boots on the tile, or the familiar flick of the hallway light. But nothing came. The door shut quietly, but there was no movement, no voices, no footsteps. Just silence again, with that faint hiss of the heater and the hum of the fridge. I called out, casual at first, figuring someone had come in through the side door to grab something. No answer. I called again, louder this time. Still nothing. That silence was heavy. Not the normal kind you get in a small building at night, but the kind where you suddenly hear everything. The ticking clock, the wind outside, even the faint creak of the roof. I pushed my chair back and stood up, grabbed the flashlight from the counter, and walked into the hallway. The light switch by the kitchen door flickered on the fluorescent tubes above, but the side corridor was still dark. I could see the faint shape of the side door at the far end closed. No footprints near it that I could see, though the floor was dull and patchy from years of salt and wear. I thought maybe whoever it was had gone straight into the bay. Sometimes guys came in to check the trucks late, do paperwork, or get something from their locker. I clicked on the flashlight and went through the door into the main engine bay. The motion sensor light above, Engine 2 blinked on at that exact moment. A sharp click and then a dull yellow glow spreading across the trucks. That sensor only triggered when someone moved within about 15 feet of the truck. I froze just inside the doorway, scanning with my flashlight, half expecting to see one of the guys crouched or moving behind the rig. Nothing. The big red truck sat still, gleaming under the harsh light, hoses rolled tight, floor clean. The air smelled faintly of diesel and rubber. Then I saw the footprints. They started right near the edge of the concrete, just inside the door leading in from the hallway. Wet marks, like someone had walked in from the snow outside. They led across the bay floor toward the back wall, one after another, clear as day. But then they stopped. Not faded out, not trailed off, and just stopped. The last print ended about 2 feet from the wall, like whoever made them had vanished mid-step. I followed them slowly, sweeping my flashlight across the floor. The prints were small, not child-sized, but not large either. Maybe a size 9 boot. The edges were crisp, wet enough that the dirt and melted snow had left outlines of treads. I crouched down by the last one, touched it with my finger, still damp. The back wall was bare concrete with the usual mounted gear hooks and a few hoses coiled neatly. No door, no window. Nothing someone could have slipped through. I checked behind the truck, behind the equipment racks, even under the bench where we kept tools and rags. Nobody. Just that line of footprints ending like someone had disappeared into thin air. I remember standing there for a while, listening, trying to make sense of it. The air felt colder suddenly, like the heat from the vents wasn't reaching that part of the bay. My own breath hung in front of me in faint clouds. I walked back to the hallway, checked the side door again. It was closed tight, the latch still set. I even pulled it open, looked outside. The snow was falling heavier now, enough to leave a light dusting on the asphalt. No fresh prints outside, just the old tire tracks from earlier that day. I went back in, locked the door, and stood in the kitchen again, trying to calm myself down. The heater clanked on, blowing warm air through the vents. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. I stayed up the rest of the night, just listening to the building settle, half expecting that door to open again. In the morning, when the chief and a couple of the day guys came in, I told them what I'd seen. I didn't embellish it. Just said the door opened by itself. There were wet footprints leading to the back wall, and they stopped. One of the guys laughed at first, said maybe I was tired and seeing things. But then we pulled up the security footage from the night before. The camera facing the side door showed it clearly. 2:01 a.m. The latch clicked. The door opened halfway. No one visible. No shadow, no shape. The door stayed open for about 3 seconds, then closed again. On the bay camera, you could see the lights flick on from the motion sensor. And then, one by one, the wet footprints started appearing. Not all at once, but one after another, as if someone invisible was walking. They glistened under the light, then slowly darkened as they dried. The line stopped near the back wall, just like I'd seen. The room got quiet watching that. Nobody said much. The chief rewound it a few times, then shut the monitor off. He sat there for a moment, staring at the blank screen. Finally, he said we weren't keeping that footage, told us to delete it and let it go. He didn't sound angry, just tired, like he'd seen something like it before or didn't want to deal with what it might mean. So we erased it. Later that day, one of the older volunteers mentioned that back in the 80s, there'd been a mechanic who slipped and got crushed behind one of the trucks in that same bay, working late by himself during a snowstorm. They didn't talk about it much, and I didn't ask more. Maybe it was just a story to make sense of what happened. Maybe not. I didn't care to find out. That bay hasn't been used since. The trucks were shifted around, and Engine 2 was moved to the other side. The floor where the prints ended stayed faintly stained for a few weeks. Darker concrete that never seemed to dry right, even after mopping. After that, they left the lights in that bay off most of the time. I still volunteer, but I never take the overnight shift anymore. Every time I drive by the firehouse late at night and see those big bay doors dark and still, I can picture that line of footprints glistening under the yellow light, leading nowhere. And even now, years later, when the weather turns cold and the snow starts to fall, I can still hear that faint creak of the side door in my head, opening, slow and careful, like someone still trying to come inside.